blast from the past. Remember when you laughed.
Hello and welcome to Big Kids TV Podcast, the show where we dive into the animated gems of yesteryear. Those classic cartoons that shaped our childhoods and still hold a special place in our hearts. I'm Chris, and today we're shining a well-deserved spotlight on a show that might not always get the same recognition as other shows of its time, but it's undeniably a charming and quirky part of British animation history. Henry's Cat. If you grew up in the UK in the 1980s or the early 1990s, chances are you've encountered this laid-back yellow feline with a vivid imagination, a love for adventure, and of course a particular fondness of food. But despite its simple, hand-drawn aesthetic and light-hearted storytelling, Henry's Cat has a wit and charm that made it stand out. It was a show that didn't rely on high-energy action or elaborate animation, yet it captivated young audiences with its whimsical humour, gentle narration, and the distinctive style of its creator. So, who exactly created Henry's Cat? And how did such a seemingly simple show develop such a loyal fan base over the years? In today's episode, we're going to take a trip down memory lane to explore the origins of Henry's Cat, the mastermind behind its creator, and the unique storytelling approach that made it so different from many other shows of the time. Along the way, we'll also touch on what made the show's humour so distinctively British, and why it still holds up as a nostalgic treasure for those of us who grew up watching it. And if you've never seen Henry's Cat before, don't worry. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why it remains such a beloved and underrated classic. So, whether you're a long-time fan, or a casual viewer, or someone who's just discovering this whimsical world for the first time, grab a cup of tea, maybe a packet of your favourite sweets, and let's get started. What was Henry's Cat? For those who need a refresher, or if you missed it entirely, Henry's Cat was a British animated series that first aired in 1983 and ran until 1993. It followed the daydreaming adventures of a chubby yellow cat who belonged to a mysterious owner named Henry. Except we never actually see Henry. This show had an incredibly distinctive style, a mix of simple, almost childlike animation and very dry, surreal humour. It was narrated in its entirety by one man, Bob Godfrey, a legendary British animator, whose voice gave the series its unique charm. The pacing was slow and meandering, but that was part of its appeal. It was a show that took its time, letting the humour land subtly. But don't mistake its simplicity for laziness. Henry's Cat had a clever, story-like quality that made it stand out from other cartoons of the era. The animation was minimal, yet expressive, with characters often drawn in a bold, wobbly lines that gave them a hand-drawn warmth. The backgrounds were sparse, focusing all attention on the characters and the whimsical antics. At the heart of the show was Henry's Cat himself, a laid-back, slightly naive dreamer with a bottomless imagination and appetite. He was joined by a cast of equally eccentric friends, including Chris Rabbit, a confident and sometimes overly serious rabbit who often tried, and failed, to be the voice of reason. Douglas Dog, a somewhat nervous and excitable character who would often get caught up in Henry's Cat's schemes. Mosey Mouse, a tiny but determined little mouse with a lot of personality. And not forgetting Rum Barbar, the pompous and villainous ram who frequently found himself at odds with Henry's Cat. Each episode revolved around Henry's Cat embarking on an absurd adventure. Whether it was becoming a detective, an inventor, a deep sea diver, or even running for president, his ideas often started out small but quickly spiraled into outlandish adventures, always narrated with a wry, knowing humour. One of the most distinct aspects of Henry's Cat was its use of wordplay and dry, deadpan humour. Unlike the more manic, action-packed cartoons of the time, it relied on clever narration, whimsical storytelling, and a delightful British sense of absurdity. It didn't talk down to kids. Instead, it trusted its audience to appreciate humour that was both silly and sophisticated. It may not have been the flashiest show on TV, but Henry's Cat had a quiet magic, one that still lingers for those who grew up watching it. The creative minds behind Henry's Cat. Henry's Cat was the brainchild of two figures, Stan Hayward, who was the writer, and Bob Godfrey, the animator and narrator. Now, Bob Godfrey wasn't just an animator. This was a man who had won an Academy Award for his work on the short film Great in 1975, which took a humorous look at the life and works of Victorian engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He was also nominated for multiple BAFTAs throughout his career. Godfrey's animation style was instantly recognisable, rough, energetic, and full of charm. A far cry from the polished perfection of Disney or the exaggerated squash and stretch of Warner Brothers. His work had a certain handmade quality where the imperfections were part of the appeal. He wasn't interested in glossy animation. He wanted to make people laugh, often through sheer absurdity. His love for British wit, particularly its silliness, dryness and surrealism, shone through in everything he did. And then there was Stan Hayward, the man behind the words. While Godfrey brought the movement and personality, Hayward crafted the stories, short, sharp, and deceptively simple. His scripts were full of wordplay, oddball logic, and moments of quiet, philosophical humour. Hayward had a way of making the ridiculous feel profound, almost like he was playfully nudging the audience with a knowing wink. His dialogue often carried a subtle sophistication, making Henry's Cat a show that could entertain both children and the adults watching it with them. Together, Godfrey and Hayward were a perfect pairing. Their work on Henry's Cat resulted in a show that was clever, gentle, yet witty, simple, yet rich with charm. It may not have had the same global reach as other shows of its time, but for those who grew up with it, Henry's Cat remains a classic example of what makes British animation so uniquely special. The quirky humour of Henry's Cat. If you watched Henry's Cat today, you'll notice how different it feels from other cartoons of the time. While American cartoons were all about action-packed and slapstick, Henry's Cat was, well, polite. A typical episode went something like this. Henry's Cat would come up with a ridiculous idea, like becoming a detective, inventing a time machine, or even running for president. He would rope in some of his friends like Chris Rabbit, Douglas Dog or Pansy Pig. A series of increasingly absurd events would unfold, usually involving misunderstandings, puns and gentle satire. And then finally everything would wrap up in a very British, matter-of-fact way. I think one of my favourite episodes is the treasure hunt episode, where Henry's Cat decides to become a pirate and digs up the garden looking for the treasure, only to realise that the treasure was a tin of biscuits all along. Complete classic. The humour wasn't really in your face, it was understated, full of wordplay and irony, and a lot of people think that Henry's Cat was a little bit like a children's version of Monty Python. The mystery of Henry. Now let's talk about the biggest mystery of the show. Who was Henry? We never see Henry. We never hear about him, and Henry's Cat just exists in this world without his owner ever showing up. There are a few theories. Some fans speculate that Henry doesn't exist. He's just a made up figure like an imaginary friend. Henry abandoned the cat, which is why he always daydreams about bigger things. The whole show is just a figment of Henry's Cat's imagination. He's making up these adventures to pass the time. And some people say that Stan Hayward originally had a story about a boy called Henry and his cat, but over time, Henry slowly disappeared and the cat became the main character, and there we have Henry's cat, and we'll never know for sure. But that's part of the charm. It gives Henry's cat this weird dreamlike quality, like a bedtime story you only half remember. The unexpected world of Henry's cat's merchandise. For a show that always felt like a bit like a hidden gem, Henry's cat actually had a surprising amount of merchandise. Some of it was pretty standard for the time, like annuals, soft toys, keyrings, and books. But there were also some really unique and charming items that you don't really see with other classic cartoons. One of my favourites has to be the knitting patterns. Yes, Henry's cat officially had knitting patterns. Looking back, they're actually really quite charming. If you or a relative ever knitted one of these back in the day, you basically had a one-of-a-kind Henry's cat bit of merchandise, and I kind of loved that. Then there were puzzles, games and soaps, because naturally when you think of a sleepy yellow cat, you think of the bath. There was even a record album with music and stories from the show, which is a real collector's item now. And of course, he regularly appeared in the Buttons comic. If you were a kid in the 80s, you might remember Buttons, a comic magazine that featured Henry's cat alongside other cartoon strips. But maybe the most unexpected bit of Henry's cat merchandise history was his partnership with Woolwich. Yes, this laid-back, food-loving cat was actually used to help teach children about saving money. Woolwich Building Society used him in promotions to encourage kids to start saving their pocket money, which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. This was a cat who spent most of his time dreaming about adventures and eating sweets, and now he was meant to be a financial role model. It's just another quirky little detail that makes Henry's cat so special. The show wasn't just about the episodes, it was a part of a whole little world of nostalgic oddities. The legacy of Henry's cat. Despite its cult status, Henry's cat never quite reached the global success of Danger Mouse, Postman Pat or Paddington, but it still had a big cultural impact in the UK. It was a staple of children's TV throughout the 80s as well as the early 90s. It had a distinctive visual style, simplistic, yet unmistakable. Its humour surely influenced later British kids shows like Peppa Pig, as well as Charlie and Lola. And Bob Godfrey's animation style inspired generations of animators, proving you didn't need flashy animation to make something memorable. Even today, Henry's cat is fondly remembered by those who grew up watching it. And you know what? It still holds up. There's something soothing about its slow, meandering storytelling, its gentle humour, and its oddball charm. So, what made Henry's cat so special? It was a quiet, understated, quirky little show with a big heart. It didn't rely on flashy action or loud characters. It just let the humour flow naturally, inviting you into its world at a gentle pace. It's a kind of show that if you watched it as a child, it sticks with you, even if you can't quite remember the details. It had a dreamlike, nostalgic magic that's so rare in modern children's TV. So, whether you're revisiting it or discovering it for the first time, Henry's cat is well worth a watch. And if you find yourself daydreaming about jelly beans and moon rockets, you might just have a little bit of Henry's cat in you too. That's it for today's episode of Big Kids TV Podcast. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And let us know what your favourite memory of Henry's cat is. You can reach us on social media or drop us an email at contact@bigkidstvpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, stay animated.
Big Kids TV Podcast, bringing back the blast from the past. Remember